Good day, everyone. It's Kevin with VintiqueSound.com, and today we're having a look at the new Groove Agent 5. Number one is the file browser. What's cool is that anytime I have Groove Agent open, I already have access to a bunch of different samples, and I can quickly go in and just switch my pad samples very quickly built into the same software. You can also undock this window, so if you prefer to have it somewhere more convenient, that's fine. Number two is the ability to adjust the size of the window. And this is fantastic. Before, you were limited to just the standard size, which would be this size right here. It's especially difficult to work with the patterns and to try and come up with a pattern in this tiny little window where you're constantly having to scroll left, right, up, and down, no ability to change the size. Now I have a much better view of the patterns. I have a much better view of the mixer looks kind of weird, but I have a much better view of the sample, the different velocity range of the samples on each pad, etc., etc. And for the standalone mode, you have a maximize window, so you can quickly just take up the entire screen. My suggestion for Steinberg is to add the maximize button to the VST, simply because it's almost impossible to get a nice full screen without taking up too much time. Number three, Steinberg has doubled the number of stereo output buses you can have for Groove Agent. You can now have 32 stereo outputs for each and every instance of Groove Agent. And what this means is you can output any pad to 32 different stereo buses. So if I want, I could go kick, snare, tom, floor tom, hi-hat, etc., all the way down the list and have up to 32 sounds. And then I could process all those sounds in Cubase with their own separate channel and their own separate inserts, EQ, sends, etc. Number four, you now have the ability to stack 32 different velocity layers per pad. So let's say you have a very complicated VST instrument such as a live drum recording and it's sampled in Groove Agent. You can now get 32 different velocity samples for each and every pad or each and every instrument piece, like the kick drum for instance. And when you have the pad on velocity mode, when you trigger the pad at a certain range of velocity, which you can adjust using this here, you can see that the crossover point here is at 71. So if I click on the pad on the bottom side of the pad, it's a lower velocity, and you'll see that it's triggering the first sample. Once I trigger 71 velocity or higher, it's going to trigger the second sample because that is the assigned velocity crossover point. Number five is the brand new acoustic drum kit instrument called the Kit. So if we have a listen to the Kit, you can tweak the overhead and room mic bleed. You can tune the drums. You can set the attack, the hold, and the decay factor. You can then go into the mixer, tweak some settings like EQ, compressor, tape saturation, envelope shaper. You have 4 auxiliary sends for effects and whatnot. You have the individual faders. And this is for each individual piece of the kit. So the kick, snare, hi-hats, toms. Tons of room in the snare. No room. Some overhead. Etc. Number 6 is there's more than 30 new kits for EDM, trap, and other styles of music. You can see it includes artists over here. So if you search for those artists, here you could see Joe Ford, you could see Raw Tech. So let's pull up a trap kit. This trap kit actually also comes with some bass hits. And included in all this new content is MIDI Grooves. So if you go into the browser in this MIDI section, what's weird is, I don't know if this is a bug or not, but you can't take that MIDI groove and put it onto the session. Even though it looks like it's supposed to, it's not doing anything. But the good thing is that you can drop it into the pattern section of the kit. So I could drop this into the pattern, and then from the pattern pad, I can drop that into the session. So yeah, I don't know if that's a bug or what, but I would assume you could just drag it from the MIDI in the browser window into your session. That would make the most sense. Number 7 is the new Decompose function, and you'll find it in the little tab up here. What it's doing is it's analyzing the sample, it's separating any tonal aspect of the sound, so anything that sounds like it has a pitch involved, separates that from a noise part of the sample that has no pitch value. And when you apply that separation, it's actually creating 2 different samples to trigger with. So for instance, we have this kick drum, and we can pre-listen to what the tonal and noise will sound like. That's the tonal aspect, and that's the noise aspect. And if we apply those changes, you can see it's broken down the single sample into 2 separate samples, one being tonal, one being the noise. In order to process them separately, you do have to make sure you're in the selected samples mode as opposed to pad mode. And just remember, pad mode means you're applying changes to the entire pad, which includes every sample that's on that pad. Select means that only the selected samples will be changed. So for instance, the pitch, I'm tweaking just the tonal. You can hear the noise has remained the same. If I pitch that down, or up. So let's try 2 separate things here. I'm going to do a pitch envelope. We're going to go from high to low. You can hear that it's affecting only the tonal part. If we do an A-B comparison between a decomposed pitch envelope and a non-decomposed pitch envelope, you can hear there is quite a bit of difference. One really good thing is for filtering off noise and adding different types of distortion and stuff like that. So I've reset everything in the pitch envelope. And now we're going to filter off the low end on the noise. We're going to add a little bit of distortion and resonance. To the tonal piece, we'll add some tube distortion. This will have maybe a top end cutoff, so a low pass filter, a little bit of resonance, and some distortion. And now combined, So maybe we will amp up the noise a little bit. And we'll do some fade outs. There we go. So that's, I think that's where the power lies. That's a much more aggressive kick, fairly well sound designed, with two puzzle pieces, trying to fit the tonal part to be the low, beefy, somewhat distorted end of things, and then the noise part of the kick with more distortion, mostly only from the low mids to the high frequency content. And those two puzzle pieces fit very well together. They complement each other in the frequency spectrum and frequency content. Number 8, it's the ability to solo each sample individually in the pad. So you've seen me done this already. It's by clicking this little S button here, and whatever sample is highlighted is the one that you will hear in solo. And for me, this blows my mind why this was not a feature to begin with. Thinking back when I was building drum kits in here and I had multiple layers of drums, the only way I could hear the individual processing that I'm doing on these separate samples was to literally go into the other samples, drop the volume to -infinity, and then go back to the sample that I'm working on, and then go back and then change the volume back to what I was, and like it was just a gong show. But now this is great. You have the ability to solo. The only thing is that you can't hover and select multiple samples. So let's say you have 4 samples on a kick. One of them is the low end. Another one is the top end sort of clickiness. And then 2 more are like the noise aspect of it. And you're trying to listen to just the 2 noise ones. Well, you can't do that because when you try to select multiple, it doesn't work. So maybe that's a feature that Steinberg will add or can add in the future. Number 9 is these 3 tiny little buttons here. You now have the ability to show the channel sum or just the left and right part of the sample. You can show it visually behind the pitch or the filter envelope or the amp envelope. Whenever I tweak the amp, it's actually now visually representing what the amp is doing to the samples. And this is true for the filter. So you can see as I change the cutoff frequency, it's reflecting that change. Likewise, the pitch, whenever I change the pitch and do things with the envelope, it's also reflecting that change. Number 10 is the ability to live sample into Groove Agent. Now, I still have not figured out how to tweak the inputs when you're opening Groove Agent as a VST, as a plugin in a DAW. But here I have Groove Agent as a standalone, and I've configured my inputs and outputs and my MIDI and everything. And you can see down here below when we go into the recorder tab, you have some different options. You can go single mode, auto next, which is great because you can go, let's say C1, C2, C3, and the auto next will, once the first sample is recorded, C1, it'll set the entire thing up for recording for C, whatever the next key is. And then you can just click the key, it records automatically, and then it'll jump to the next one, hit the next key, it'll record, and so on and so forth. And this is a feature that's also built into Halion, and it's really easy to get a bunch of samples for one single instrument. It's very handy. And then you can set it to be a one-shot. You can select auto-normalize. You can have auto-trim out the silence. You can select a threshold for beginning the sample recording, and that can be either an audio threshold or a MIDI note on or off signal, or you can just have a manual record button and then record your sample. Right now I'm setting the threshold to be -45 and I have it at a fixed duration. You could also have the recording stop at the same sort of thresholds or manually. And when we go into the options tab, we can select either a mono source or whatever the source is of the channel. So if it's a stereo, it'll automatically recognize it as a mono or a stereo and record it as such. You can select the bit depth, so 16-bit, 24, or 32-bit float, the format, WAV, and AIF. And you can choose where to save the sample and then how to name that sample. So for instance, I have my DX7, a timpani sound. So we're going to hit record with the audio threshold. And you can see here, it recorded the sample just directly through Groove Agent, and then it saved the file to where I specified it. Number 11 is the pre-listening of pads and styles and pre-listening mode in general. In the browser menu, you can see down below here, there's a pre-listen in place button. And when that's selected, whenever you flip between the different samples, it's going to play and audition that sample. But also what's cool is in the MIDI and the styles, you can preview that with the kit that you have. So now I have this Bulldozer Beat Agent kit. And when I browse through the different MIDI styles and whatnot, it's going to preview that. Number 12, you now have the ability to hot swap samples on whichever pad or whichever sample is highlighted. Now if I have this button right here, this replace pad focused sample highlighted, whenever I select a new sample, it's actually replacing it with whatever was played here. So if there's a single sample on the pad, it's just going to replace that kick drum entirely with a new sample. If there's multiple samples, then it's going to replace whatever's highlighted. Number 13, you can now export the mixer settings into Cubase. And this was pointed out by someone that it is strangely odd that you can only export the mixer settings from the acoustic drums and all the other like normal drum kits, but not for the beat agent. So you can see here, I can right click on the kit, I can export mixer and effects to Cubase or just the mixer. And you can see here, it's created this new channel or new track. There's only one right now because I only have one destination output, which is the main kit mix. And if I had more outputs assigned, like a special output for the kick, the snare, the hats, that would export multiple channels. And if anyone is wondering, in order to revert the mixer export, you actually have to go into Groove Agent and undo that command. So it's not enough to just delete the channel in Cubase. It's actually like if I delete this here, the mixer doesn't come back. I have to actually undo that feature in Groove Agent. And number 14, there is 20 new MIDI styles in the style of blues, prog rock, jazz, funk, and etc., etc. The styles is something that takes a little while to get familiar with, but it's essentially a collection of patterns based on a style of drumming. So like funk drumming has a certain rhythm and certain collection of patterns and fills and stuff. In this MIDI section, this MIDI player is what it's called, you can do some tweaking. So you can half time it, you can double it, you can change the velocity scale, gate scale, and swing factor. What's cool is that you can drag that MIDI pattern or MIDI sequence directly into Cubase. And you can see it created it down there. So that is the MIDI player part of it, which is in conjunction with the patterns. The styles is kind of a similar thing where it's a collection of patterns and grooves, but the styles is much more complex, and there's the main sequence, there's the variation of fills, there's the variation of endings, and variation of intros. So one style, such as Fusion 124, has all these different aspects to it. And then you can play the sequence here, switch between the different fills, grooves, endings, and stuff on the fly, and you can change it in complexity and intensity. So hopefully that explains it. And the whole point of this was to show you that there's 20 new MIDI styles, which when you think about it is quite a lot. There's a lot involved in the styles. There's a lot of programming that Steinberg has done that you can use in your production, borrow pieces, use that, maybe tweak it to your liking, and then come up with an entire song or an entire sequence based off of what they've already done. Number 15 is the auto complexity mode, but there's also the ability to export whatever that auto complexity has generated into MIDI and then load it into the project on its own MIDI channel. So as I demonstrated, whenever you have the pattern playing, the auto complexity is jumping between complexity on its own, depending on the length that you've described here. And then it takes that and basically sums it down to MIDI. And if we export that at the one bar complexity timing, and then I turn the auto complexity off, we can compare the two MIDI, and you can see that the MIDI pattern is different. So it's the ability to do the auto complexity, but also the ability to export how the auto complexity is changing the MIDI down into its own MIDI track. I'm going to leave you with a small comment. Brian L'Espoir, I hope I pronounced that right. He wrote here at the very end of a comment, he couldn't sleep thinking about whether he would upgrade to the new version or not. And at 2 a.m, he stood up and just bought the damn upgrade, and then he slept pretty well that night. And I'm going to direct you to my website, vintiquesound.com, where you can check out the services that I offer. You can check different previews of an unmixed, mixed, and a mixed and mastered version of these tracks. You can also go to the shop and then see the different things that I offer, such as full mixing and mastering packages, only mixing, only mastering, complete editing packages. And I also have a blog where right now I only have one blog post, but I'm going to be working on getting a bunch of high quality blogs that you can read at your leisure. If you are purchasing an audio engineering service or package, when you type in the code "winter is coming" with capital letters on the first letter of each word and apply it to your cart, it's going to enter a 50% discount on that audio engineering service. And you can check out and pay with PayPal. You can add any quantity of the package you need or want, and I will get back to you within a few days. We can discuss the project, and if you check the description, you also have up to 3 revisions for the mixing and the mastering. And like always, if you have any questions, you can fill out this cute little questionnaire form thing here, or you can just email me at my email here at info@vintiquesound.com. So thanks for watching. Take care and bye-bye.